Chairperson.
All right, everyone. Good morning. It's time, so let's start. This is the IETF 101 London. This happened to be ANIMA working group meeting. If you're having in the wrong room, still have leave to find your right working group. Today we have one session for 2.5 hours. This is the note wheel. Everybody should read it. And by show up here, you should already await. So before they begin the meeting, we already hand out the blue sheet. Make sure you sign it before you leave the room. And we need a volunteer for Jabber. Anybody volunteer for Jabber?
Anybody? Michael? Jabber, I can channel people, sure.
Thank you, Michael. Anybody for minutes taker? Thank you, Bing. And we also have the remote participation. At least we will have 2 presenters today from remote, Michael and Laurent. They're already on. All those slides are already uploaded, so you can find the materials. And the mailing list for ANIMA still one of the main working place. So everybody should looking at the looking at the mailing list and try to invoke the discussing if you have anything want to make the working group aware. This meeting is chaired by myself, Shing, and Terence Ackert. This is today's agenda. We have only 3 working group draft present today because the others are already sent to IESG or on the way to IESG. And we have a lot of new stuff present today. Guidance for ASA, informational distribution in autonomic networking, and constraint voucher profile for bootstrapping protocols and transfer packet data over the grasp, autonomic slice networking, DNS-SD compatible service discovery in grasp, and also young model for autonomic network infrastructure and any extensions for short-lived certificates. That will give us enough time to fill for the 2.5 hour session. This is a brief update for the status of all the working group milestones. We had the grasp already set in the editor, RFC editor for almost half year. It's misdrive because the ACP and the Copper. Also, the ANIMA Profix management is already also in the misdrive situation for 3 months already. It means ACP and Copper, also the bootstrapper and grasp. Grasp is already there. And we have the ANIMA voucher with RFC editors since last month, so that's went well. And the stable connectivity also with the RFC editor since last month. And we submit to IESG for the autonomic control plan in January this year. It's in the situation waiting for AD write-up. So that's also out of the working group stage. we have the reference model already passed the working group last call in January. It's still in the write-up for document shared. Hopefully, I'll do it this week. Waiting for the IPR disclosure confirmation from others. And the bootstrapping key infrastructure, it's planning to have a working group last call after this meeting. So Shepherd already done the thorough review, and I believe the others already addressed the comments. Right, Terence?
Yes.
All right. And we have one new working group document since last meeting. That's the GRASP application programming interface. So that's newly adopted, still in the early stage of the working group document. Okay, that's all for the milestone and working group documents. All right, so any agenda bash? Once, twice, go. Okay, so next will be Michael remotely. Okay. Where's the button? Okay. Michael, you're on.
Oh. Okay, can you hear me?
Oh, easy, go easy. We heard you a little bit too loud.
Okay. I don't know what I can do about that. Is that okay?
Can you go to the next room?
I'll do my best.
Further down the volume, please.
I can't regulate any volume on my side, so I'm afraid you'll have to do that. Is it okay? Shall I start?
Yeah, get a little bit away from the mic. It's really very loud.
Okay. I'll do my best. Is that okay now?
Better, yes.
Okay. Okay. To the next slide, please. Okay. Relatively few changes from the last version. This is practically all related to the long review that Sheng has done. Thanks for that review, Sheng. So this is basically a lot of final cleanups before we go into the publication process. So for example, we had still a lot of comments in about the current scope, and that the work is limited to the charter and stuff like that. All of that is removed now because obviously in a final document that should not be in there. A lot of editing around that in many different places. That involves, so the wording has been changed basically to focus on the first simple implementation phase. That was always the intention, but it's more clear. So no factual change in there. It's just editorially different. We'll have more phases afterwards. Some of the changes that were more relevant is the distinction between what Turnus called in his document the GACP and the ACP. We have the generic autonomic control plane, which is essentially it's an abstract control plane, the same way we talk about routing protocols as a control plane. So it's a generic notion of a control plane, whereas the ACP is a specific implementation that is described in the corresponding ACP draft. And so in the draft, in the reference model now, we distinguish more clearly between when we mean a generic control plane, the GACP, or when we mean the implementation of the ACP as described by the draft. And so to be very clear also here, again, the GACP could be implemented in many different ways. The ACP, as per document, is one implementation thereof. Then the state table, we had lots of questions around what happens about power cycling. So now the state diagram includes the power cycle event in all states. To be clear about that, I think that was more a clarification. Haven't heard any more feedback on that either. There were some clarifications about LDEF ID and IDEF ID, which goes out in which case. That is also clarified now. and we reduced the number of explicitly mentioned authors to 5, and introduced a contributor section where Bing, John, and Pierre are in now. Apart from that, lots of editorial nits, and that's really it. Next slide, please. So we have the working group last call is passed, and yeah, next should be the ISG review, and Sheng just had that on his slide. That's it from my side. Any questions?
Not from room. So I guess we are doing well, Michael.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Off you go. Then the next will be SAP. Is that you?
Yep. I mean, this is the short one, so can I still? Okay. Next slide. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's me. There we go. Okay, so we had in 100 we had the number 12, and we still had a good review afterwards from Brian, William, and Yong Kang, and so there was still a good amount of fine tuning of a bunch of things the authors thought were kind of obvious, but obviously the text wasn't. So, like, for example, the VRFs really being, more what we call VRF light in the industry, even though I couldn't find for the heck of it a really good, normative reference for that. But many people would confuse what we call the VRFs with an MPLS VRF, which has this very strange core-facing behavior. Then we had the good discussion about, why we do IP in the ACP itself. And that was kind of resolved through that ACP number 4 requirement. Also, the good terminology for, what does manually configured mean, right? I mean, we meant it's not autonomically configured, but obviously in the times of SDN, manual is not a good choice of words anymore. And then we tightened down on the interoperability requirements, so specifically on the security side, making sure that AES 256 is the minimum allowed on the secure channels and must be supported. And well, I guess we'll see an IESG review further when we get to the security review there, the longer one. Yeah, the zone ID, This was one, the multi-zone stuff was one of the things we felt was very good for larger networks, but the existing implementations of ACPs didn't have that, so we ran across an issue with that as well, clarified that to make sure that it does really result in the larger scalability that was meant to do. And then I also did a major cleanup on the configured remote ACP neighbors, which I think is also going to be important for incremental first step deployments where you need to connect multiple ACP islands, for example, through an SDN controller, so that we have some crisp definition of how that should work. Yeah, and then of course a lot of textual stuff. So that ended us up with the ACP 13. Sheng did the Shepherd write-up of that, then it went over to IESG, and then basically we're getting so close to this IETF that I didn't have the time to respond to the feedback. So that's what I'm going to do next week, going through all the reviews and doing them. So we had GenArt review, we had IoT Directorate review from Pascal, SecDir review, early review only, and then routing DIR review. So yeah, so that's basically the state of that. So hopefully we'll get through the ISG review soon, and definitely I want to make sure that that's all done before 102. Any questions? All right.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So next will be Bing.
Morning, everyone. This is
No,
You need to run.
I'll do it.
Oh,
No, I'll do it. That doesn't work.
oh,
this is-
no, Leo, it doesn't work.
That doesn't work. Yeah. Tell me next page. Yeah.
This is Bin Liu talking about the API for the GRASP. Next, please. And this draft was adopted since last IETF in Singapore, and we made some revision. Next, please. This is a reminder for what the draft about. As we know, in one node there might be multiple ISAs, and they need to interact with a GRASP module. In order to reduce the implementation work for the ISA writers, we need to reuse some very basic GRASP capabilities. So we need an API to do this. And along with the standard API, we might also have some extended functionality based on GRASP in the future. For example, the information distribution functionality, which we will discuss it later today. Okay, next, please. So we define some calls. The registrar basically is for ISAs to tell the GRASP module, okay, I am online, and what's my name and what I can do, etc. And discovery calls and negotiation calls, synchronization calls, and filing calls. These calls didn't have essential changes since the last version. Next, please. Okay, the most significant change is about the event loop, because if we want the GRASP to be run in the very small, for example, level 1 or level 2 IoT nodes, we need something to handle the asynchronization communication with the ISAs. So the multi-threading for that kind of small nodes is not acceptable due to the constrained resources. So we need something called event loop. Okay, next, please. But for event loop, if we simply blocking the API calls, it is not acceptable. So we need something to work around the issue. So we use a no reply code returned by the event loop to the ISAs. This is not regarding to the GRASP message, but it's only for the event loop to maintain the state with different ISAs. Okay, next, please. And there are also some open issues. There are several GRASP features that haven't supported in the API. The explicit locator for objective, because the GRASP module can cache some discovery results, and this hasn't been opened by the API, and also the rapid mode for both synchronization and negotiation also don't have API. The next open issue is, do we need a IANA registry for the error codes? We can define the codes just as numbers and register in the IANA so that when ISAs get a number, it can know about the reason. Otherwise, we might need some text to describe what happened. That's the open issue now. Next, please.
I actually have some comment here. Why the first bullet items are any issue here? From my understanding, there's very straightforward work. You're just including that in your next version.
From technical perspective, it's not a big deal. But okay. We are struggling of whether it's good to open for the ISAs such kind of detail. Because ideally, the ISAs, they only need to care about what they want to discover. We don't want them to care too much detail, such as addresses. So that's the main concern.
No, I mean, for me, what you should do is you explore through the API. You explore whatever the ability Grasp have. You don't cut them off. Whether they are used by the ASA is the choice of ASA.
That is technically that is okay, but regarding to the design principles of what a detail is hiding and what detail is exposed. So both way can work, but which is the best way is some open issue.
I mean, what happens if you know ASA want to use such hidden functions? Is there any way to do that through API, or they have to talk to Grasp directly?
If we hide the details, it means the ASAs don't need to care about it. You only tell me what kind of another ASA you want to discover, so I can hide the locator details to you.
Yeah, sure. That for me just means you have multiple instances, some for the simple use, some for the more complicated use cases within the API. So it doesn't mean you should cut it off by yourself.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. Then for the second one, I'm not sure that one should be covered in the API document, or that something should be in the Grasp basic code specification.
Sorry, I don't quite understand your
I mean, does this error code means the error
code
between API and Grasp, or the error code inside the Grasp? That's different. So I'm not sure what you mean here.
It's inside the Grasp when something bad happen.
That's my understanding as well. But if that's so, that means we need to update the Grasp specification rather than have that in the in the API document.
Yes, it's also regarding to Grasp protocol. But in this context, the error code is mostly for ASAs. And
okay.
So that's why we talk it here.
Okay. So that means if we include in that error code, that means this document will do an update for Grasp, right?
Not really, unless we want some standardized error codes, because the error codes in Grasp.
Error codes is something normative. So if you're talking about error code with NI registration, I mean, currently this document is an informational document, right? So I don't think in any case information document could do so.
I think the main issue to me would be that the functionality expressed over Grasp is meant to be application information, right? And so the trouble is a little bit coming up with the means to establish cross-application standards. And so I try to do that in the DNS-SD stuff, which is trying to say, okay, whatever application you are, if you're trying to signal a service, then here's a standard for that. And I think that's the type of functional document, not an API document that would do that.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. I would say separate this out, maybe another draft, right?
Okay.
Okay.
And we still need help because the current open source method implementation by Brian Carpenter is based on Python. And for Python, it's very easy to deal with multi-threading, but for C program-based event loop, we still need more experienced C programmer to help us to check out whether it's okay, sufficient, some errors, etc. Okay, next, please. Comments and question? Thank you.
Yeah, we already done discussing. Thank you, Bing. So next will be Laurent. Yeah, you're on, Laurent.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah,
Can you hear me well?
you can.
Now we get the Meet Echo guy back in the room to turn up the volume after Michael's.
So you can get closer.
Can you try to be as loud as possible?
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Still louder?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's just slide.
It's good. It's perfect.
Okay. So I will present the guidelines for autonomic service agents. This is a work co-authored by Brian, Sheng, and Pierre. So please go to the next slide. Next one still. Okay, so just a quick reminder about the overall goal of this document. The goal is to help and provide guidelines to the ASA developers for the general design of their code. So why we do that? Because we expect the ASA to be written by a very diverse set of people, programmer developers, which we think are not necessarily specialized in the protocols or the internals of Anima, but more on they are more specialists on the autonomic function that they are coding. And so providing the API is a first step towards helping them in their code, but may not be sufficient. So we also provide these guidelines in order to help them to go even beyond and simplify a bit the access to developing ASA for Anima. Next slide, please.
Next page.
Yes. So from the last version, there have been a couple of changes. Essentially, a discussion in the draft. There is a discussion about different models for ASA, based either on a multi-threads or event loop approach. And so, recognizing that for simple ASA, some of the discussion may not be relevant or fully required. We implement a few changes to explain that in the case of simple ASA, some of the consideration may be put aside. There have been also a new section added for coordination or interaction with more traditional tools. So this mainly goes towards current management tools or protocols for given functions and when you plug to the devices. So this was based on the discussion we had at the last IETF meeting and also through some email exchange, especially with stores. There have been also a note added about the positioning, I will say, of the ASA versus other pieces of software, and especially towards NFV or SFC types of services that can be provided by different types of functions. So to position a bit ASA with respect to these other pieces of software. And also in the appendix, there is a new appendix try to explain, give an example about logic flow for, I would say, generic ASA about resource management to illustrate a bit the threaded model of such an ASA. Next slide, please. So this is just going through this simplified logic flow. So you have a main thread, which is here to host the main, I will say, point of the ASA. So to initiate the resource pool and start a number of threads related to the different functions of Grasp. So to the aspect of flooding, negotiating, garbage collection, etc. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah, and then you have different other threads that are running in parallel. So the floater thread, in order to periodically flood the resource parameter to all Grasp nodes, the negotiator thread that will wait and satisfy the negotiation request for the other Grasp peers, garbage collector in order to compact the resource pool. This is very specific to the ASA, which is a resource management ASA. And a sign thread in order to manage the resource request from non-autonomic devices and application and assign the resource from the pool. Next slide, please. So we have been, discussing this draft for some time now. We still are making progress on the work. So what remains to be done, the text on the coordination between the autonomic function is preliminary. It's just the first iteration. And we also ask for the group to provide feedback or inputs to this aspect. What should be considered in this draft to help the developers to consider what needs to be taken into account when coordinating among autonomic functions. We are also starting additional thoughts about other typical interactions between ASA. So I said we have this coordination aspect, which is already covered, but there may be also other types of interaction that should be taken into account and discussed in this draft. So for instance, when the different ASA needs to exchange knowledge and agree on different modes of exchanging knowledge. So this can also be a section to be developed in the draft. What I call governance, or it can also be sometimes called intent or policy-based management or whatever, but it's the link essentially with the operator or another management system in order to be, for the ASA to be configured or to be, to be initially configured to set a purpose or to set the configuration of this ASA. So there is also this interface or interaction that needs to be documented. There may be also other interactions to be considered, and this is also a question to the group. If you have specific inputs, we will welcome that in the document. So there is also in the work an example logic flow for event loop model in order to contrast with the threaded model. And the next step also will be to process the different reviews we may get and ask for working group adoption in the next steps. Next slide, please. I think it's the last one. So,
Thomas, so not sure if it's working group chair or contributor. So I guess as a working group chair, I think this is highly useful, and we'll definitely have to figure out, where we might have a charter issue with it, because ASAs in general, I guess, are not in charter. I think that the main issue we'll have with this draft is that it can become better and better the more experience we gain, right? So that's why this is maybe the one draft where I, as a working group chair, I wouldn't necessarily want to have it finished as quickly as possible. But the more of other ASA work we're doing, the more I think feedback we can provide for this draft. So, for example, the what I would like to do is to revisit this draft versus what I can see the GRASP DNS stuff as a kind of GRASP library on top of GRASP to do, and then basically feed that experience back, and hopefully we'll have other input into this draft, and I think that should make it better over time.
Agreed. This is a bit the challenge of making it available to help the designers, the developer of ASA, but also, stabilize it in order to make it useful as a reference to be used, and maybe send some updates or new revision. I don't know how this can be approached from a process point of view.
No, and I think that it would be good to say that the working group really wants to have this. If we want to have the ongoing ask for other work to say, okay, you need to feedback what you think you need as guidelines into this draft, right? Otherwise, as long as it stays individual, people might ignore it with other work they're doing in this space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Xing here. As far as I remember, we actually have at least two documents not in today's agenda. For those two documents, which they try to share in some deployment experience. So you should have a contact with those people who has deployment experience, and to collect their feedback on your document, our document. Yeah.
Can you precise which documents or which people you are talking about?
There are two documents was giving deployment experience in as far as I remember for IoT network. Yeah, so they definitely has some usage of ASAs and autonomic network infrastructure. So you should have their experience as your input here, right? Yeah, Bing, go ahead.
Yeah, Bin Liu. Sheng just mentioned the IoT-related implementation. We used to have a draft to describe. We use GRASP as management signaling in a mesh-based IoT devices. And we do implement some very simple ASA. Yes. We can discuss the details offline. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we will exchange on that. Thank you.
It's Alex Gallis. I have 3 suggestions for you, Laurent and others, or maybe comments, hopefully in a positive way. Definitely, it's absolutely essential to deploy these ANIMA systems in many ways and make it easier. That's taking as granted. But I have to say there are some problems here. For example, in one area which could be improved in your draft is to better describe the border between service, let's say, system write-up versus ASI write-up. In other words, what are these? How to move from this application, which you describe, towards services? Because that's a driving force. I don't think that this is a clear answer in your current system. Second, it's emerging that NAV is coming in a big way. There are some research work vis-a-vis of improving the way in which and guideline for NAV application to be written. And this has to be taken into account, which means that it's a time to embrace the virtualization significantly, because that's where autonomicity will be applied first. Currently, there are no autonomic networks. And my final comment is, autonomicity has a big subject, and based on a bit of my experience on publishing maybe 100 papers on this, is that there is not such a thing covering all the aspects. So it's time to decouple it, autonomicity in terms of specific self-X capabilities for which ASA application or other parts of the ANIMA could be better applied. One framework fit all, it's not going to be easy to put in deployment in all the aspects, including the control plane, which was described recently. I'm afraid I'm not sure that this is deployable. But if that is not deployable, at least the ASA application could be better deployed. And these are my 3 comments, kind requests for you to consider, maybe to with help from others. Thank you.
Alex, just before you go, for the first comment you mentioned decoupling between service. I didn't get the second part of the
currently, as I understand it, ASA elements are somewhere in between an application and a network service.
Mm-hmm.
This border is essential for the use of the overall system. So are you envisaging another layer on top of ASA related to autonomic network services? And if that's the case, maybe it's a time to define this interface, interworkings, and so on, or transform ASA into this element, which is essential for the overall applicability of ANIMA. And this is a key question.
Okay.
Based on the assumption, and that will help also the guiding or describing the best procedure or guidelines about how to write such applications or network services with these qualities. I hope that helps.
Yeah, okay, for sure. We will discuss this further. Okay, thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Thanks, Laurent.
Okay, thank you all.
Next will be Bing for information distribution.
Okay, this is a topic I just mentioned in the API thread. It's information distribution in autonomic networking. And this is some capability we want to extend in current ANI. And we also propose to reuse GRASP and a Barium protocol. Okay, next, please. Since last IETF, we had a very big change. The 0 version, we actually merged another draft. It is talking about event service. And so we have several new co-authors from the draft. And we redo a comprehensive analysis on scenario and requirements regarding to information distribution. And we also discussed the relevant GRASP extension to realize these new capabilities. Next, please. One perspective to analyze the information distribution is some very basic scenarios. The first one is one-to-one communication, which is quite straightforward. And it is typical request response, or we call it client-server model. And along with that, we also have, it could be also notification. One node actively sends some message to another. It doesn't require a previous request. That's a one-to-one scenario. And another is one-to-many. And the most simple way is just flooding. And another, a little bit more sophisticated is we don't simply flood the message to all the neighbors. We can do some reduction, which we call it partial distribution. That's the one perspective, the very basic scenario. Next slide, please. The other perspective is we can categorize the communication patterns into instant. We can also call it synchronous and asynchronous. So for the synchronous communication, the main principle is that the sender delivers the message directly to the receivers, and they don't, and they need to wait for the response because there's a session, there's some state need to be maintained. This is a synchronized model. For the asynchronized, the sender can also deliver the message directly to the receiver, but they don't wait for any response. It just simply send a message and that's all. For example, flooding is in this model. And another approach is the sender send a message indirectly. It can send it to some common struct or common module. For example, we can call it a whiteboard or shared space, etc. And that common module will deliver the message to the real receivers. That's the another perspective. Next, please. So for the asynchronizes, we listed several scenarios, and possibly will happen in autonomy network. And the first one is the reply might take a long time, so that if the sender is just waiting for the receiver, it might be a very significant performance consideration because of the long time. And another is multiple nodes, they might share the common interest, so they don't need to necessarily exchange information among them in an instant model. They can exchange, for example, the whiteboard between them. And they can also establish some common view among the ASAs. This can be considered as some kind of distributed storage. And they have the same database, but the database is distributedly stored by different ASAs. And the last one is there could be one node, it aggregates every data and then just send the data in a bulk way. These are several scenarios. Next, please. So in a perspective of a autonomic node, in order to support the different patterns, whether it's synchronized or asynchronized, whether it's one-to-one or one-to-many, we need to integrate some new capabilities into the node other than the current grasp capability. So for instant information distribution, for example, the one-to-one mode, the grasp synchronization method is already supported. So this is quite straightforward. Next, please. But for the asynchronized information distribution is also one-to-one. Current grasp doesn't have the ability allow one node to actively send some information to another. So along with a synchronization message in grasp, we propose to add a new message, unsolicited synchronization for this purpose. And for flooding, the grasp already supports this. But as I said previously, if we make the flooding a little bit more sophisticated, that one node can choose part of the neighbors to be distributed the message, then we can have some selective flooding mechanism. We can achieve it by defining some objectives into the flood message. Next, please. And this is the most significant change in this document, which is mainly from the event service document. And we thought that we need a distributed data layer. There are mainly two functions. One is a distributed storage. And the information, once it's generated, it could be just sent to the network and stored in the network. The node that generates the message or it requires some message, it don't need to care about where the message is going and where the message is coming from. It's just simply to request it or send it to the network. And we propose to integrate some sub-pub approach to the current grasp, which means we need a set of subscribe a publication message. And for event queuing, for example, there are some signaling that they must be aligned in a very strict order. For example, the signaling to the light bubbles, switch on, switch off. They need to be in a very strict queue. And this is a logic entity to handle all the signaling that need to be queued. And regarding to how grasp extension can support this, we haven't really figured it out. This is an open question now. And we also need APIs to open for the ASAs to call this asynchronous communication. Next, please. So this figure illustrates how the information distribution functionality fits into the ANI. And it is basically built on top of GRASP. And it can also open APIs to ASAs, as just mentioned previously. Next, please. Yes, any comments? And do you think this is useful work and some necessary capabilities that to be supported by the ANI?
Yes. Sorry, you want to be
Go ahead.
first?
Go ahead.
Very good. I think that this is exceptional in terms of impact towards deployment. But I would like to highlight a few issues which were somehow resolved in the past, which could be relevant to this work to move forward. One of it is that information distribution is absolutely essential. There are a lot of mechanisms that are already in place. However, sooner or later want to deploy it, you'll find out that you need to link it with one of the 6 information models available, which is used in industry. And the issue is, are you thinking about an information model agnostic distribution of data or not? And this is a key question, because the answer to this question will help progressing the distribution of information. The second issue, which is probably as important as the first, which I mentioned, is the fact that sooner or later this information distribution is like a service. It has to be treated like that. Therefore, it has to be usable by the provider of information and the sink of information, wherever they are in the network. And in that sense, in addition to distribution, mechanisms are many. You highlighted very well some of them. There is an issue of storage, which you mentioned, distribution, distributed storage or not, which has to be part of this type of a service, but also what could be called information processing, namely aggregation of information or disaggregation of information for the purpose of the use of different things in the network. And these 3 elements will form what is called an information as a service capability, which is very important for the way in which the whole ANIMA is used. At the end of the day, part of any control loop distribution information is one element in any control loops. And these were my comments. Some of the points which I meant are already sorted out in terms of what could be solutions, and offline I could maybe give you some references for it, but I feel that this is exactly where the power of ANIMA-related infrastructure could be making a big impact. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments regarding the first question. The information model, as far as I understand now, the distribution mechanism should be agnostic to any specific information model or data model. They just about messaging mechanism, how to deliver messages to another in an efficient way. That's my understanding. But maybe when we come to real design, maybe it's necessary or maybe it's better to binding with some specific information model or data model, but currently we haven't figured out any requirement to do that. And for the second question, sorry, I just missed the point.
The last point is about information distribution, which is important, should be seen in a context of information as a service for all that. And there are many other functionality in addition to distribution of information, which need to be partly put together. In addition to that, distribution is storage and processing, because not all the information is needed. Sometimes you aggregate, some you disaggregate for a purpose of the use of in a particular application.
Okay, and I agree with you that the distribution will be a kind of service provided to the individual nodes or the ASAs. For other aspects, rather than simply sending and receiving messages, for example, as you mentioned, the processing of the information, how to aggregate different messages. I'm not very sure now, but I think maybe that's some additional application layer things. But I do agree we need to consider other aspects, not only sending or caching messages. Thank you.
This is Jefferson Nobre. First, thank you for this valuable work. I think it's very important. And we have a draft which is called ANIMA Intent Policy and Format. I don't know if you are aware of, but there's a section, Sheng is also an author of this draft. There's a section on the distribution of policies that I think that maybe we can talk about to withdraw this part from this draft and just use the way that you are proposing to distribute information in your draft. Yeah, so if you can, you can team up for to see if there is fits, but I think it's okay to.
Sure. And intent or policy is actually one of the main target of this mechanism.
Yeah.
Sure.
I think this is more mature than the part of distribution in our draft, so probably it would be best to to just adopt your.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I quickly jump in? Sorry, I was too lazy to get up. So two drafts. The more fun one. If when this gets adopted as a working group draft, probably don't want to do it earlier. But the RFC editors have been asking if folks want to try getting the SVG graphics in, and your slide 5 and 9 look exactly like, making this a lot more nice to read for somebody who is not privy to the presentation. You have to get rid of the color, unfortunately, but that was so that would be the fun part, to leverage this stuff. So the more thing like getting in front of a lot of tomatoes. So the way I see a lot of the stuff we've been starting with GRASP or so, becoming more easy to explain to other folks in IETF, we're trying to do these things better, right? I mean, we try to eat our own dog food by starting doing CBOR in GRASP, and so these are all different layers of trying to, in the future, rebuild IETF protocols better than they've been done so far, right? And I'm not sure, unfortunately, Carsten isn't here, kind of how much they've been able to explain to other folks the benefit of CBOR, right? But then the messaging with GRASP, and then the communication paradigms, which are multi-party, those are all things maybe where it would help to really say in a document like this. So if this would have been available, I don't know, 10 years ago for the following IETF standard protocol FUBAR, this is how you could have done it better. And then even better if you get a review of that part from somebody who did the implementation of that RFC FU or so, right? And they say, yeah, I mean, if we had that, there would actually been how we could have done it better, right? I mean, even starting with the CBOR stuff, right? All these, TLV, one-off TLVs that CBOR makes easier than the graphs, the standard, message exchanges, and in these communication patterns, right? So trying to find examples, references where people would chime in and say, yeah, so those existing protocols could have done better with this. I think that makes a lot of implementers a lot more interested to read this, because otherwise it's all very abstract.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Edward Dean. This is very interesting. This is kind of a clarifying question. I see a lot of parallels between this and some of the big data projects that came out like 5-10 years ago. One of the underlying issues there was the lack of concern around security of the functionality of the system. So it was something that was kind of added in after the fact. So is the security of the pub/sub model, the distributed data model, something that's part of the initial scope of this draft, or is that something that's going to be addressed afterwards?
Personally, I think it should be in scope, but whether it's in this specific document or another document, that's something we need to consider in the future. But right now, we still focus on the messaging mechanism itself. But I agree with you, security is something we must to consider.
Yeah, now's the best time to get it in, because if you try to put it in after the fact, it's much more
So
difficult.
the current architecture is that GRASP is expected to have a secure transport layer, right? So that all the GRASP messages are, secured within a single domain, right? So you're basically having a GRASP domain, and only the members of the GRASP domain are, privy to, receive, authenticate, and decrypt the messages. And that is in the current, ANI framework done through the ACP. So if somebody takes GRASP, puts in a different context, he would basically have to show how you get the same level of security of the messages, right? Because that was exactly the GRASP review we had with the ISG security review from Eric, that otherwise, GRASP is fine, but if you need to start encrypting the information elements inside of it, we haven't really achieved a lot. Right, so the main issue, I think, with respect to this draft is it's very easy to say GRASP as a point-to-point connection and just use TLS. But if you want to have the group communication, then basically setting up the group security for that is the real challenge. And we've done it with the ACP, but now if people don't like the ACP in other contexts and try to come up with another group security scheme, right? I mean, Brian over there knows also kind of a lot of the things we've done in the past. So yes, we understand this, but I think it should be a solution below this, but really with the current architecture underneath GRASP.
Okay, so just one more question. I'm not an expert in GRASP in any way, but is the authentication of the transport, are you piggybacking the authentication on authentication of the transport, or is there abilities to layer different authentication models on top of just transport authentication?
So I mean, right now it's really you have a set of certificates that form the group, and that's basically what you use for the authentication of all the transport connections.
Okay.
Yeah, but it could equally be transport, right? I mean, if I'm saying everybody in the group has the certificate and I'm just building it from a bunch of TLS connection, I would call that application layer. So we're just using IPsec, and that's why we're calling it network layer. So.
Okay.
Any more questions? Comments? Thanks, B. Next will be Michael. Tell me next page. Yeah.
Pardon me?
Tell me when you.
Oh, next slide. Yeah, thank you. Hi. Actually, there's a couple of typos in the slide, which I actually have fixed, and I've asked the chairs to upload afterwards for the proceedings, but it didn't affect anybody. So I'm here to talk about mapping of, we're just about finished the voucher document. It's in the RFC editor queue at this point. Right. Sorry. And one of the needs that we have in applying some of the stuff to other tools is to do it in a constrained way. Next slide, please. So I'm here to tell you about a document basically reinterpreting our voucher Yang in terms of CBOR. Please ignore the pink part at the bottom. It's a copy and paste for another presentation. It doesn't belong there. So I'd like to ask to consider to have it adopted in this working group. Next slide, please. So right now for Anima, we have a bootstrapping protocol. It's called Brewski. It's in the final editing stages. It uses HTTP for everything. are HTTPS, and we think of that as for big devices and big networks like ISPs, and we'd like to redo this again in smaller networks. So right now we have a document in ACE. It's just been adopted actually after these slides were made, which puts EST over COAP. So Brewski extends EST, and what we'd like to do is now that we have it over, we'll have it over COAP. We'd like to extend it in the same way that this document extends EST over COAP in the same way that Brewski extends EST over HTTP. Some people would like to run it over DTLS. Some people would like to run it over ad hoc, and the ACE working group is again considering whether to adopt ad hoc yesterday. You might remember this diagram from the bottom, which was maybe 3 years old or something like that. And it kind of, when we were arguing for where would we do the voucher work? Would it be a netconf or ANIMA or 6TISH? And this diagram basically just gave the kind of the relationship between what's happening here and what's happening in 6TISH. We have since actually renamed things such that both 6TISH and ANIMA use the same terminology for registrars, joint proxies, and pledges. So you'll see there's other names, join node and join assistance at the bottom there. Next slide, please. So how did the vouchers change? Essentially, we serialized to CBOR, and we're using SIDS, which is I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it is a specification coming from the core working group that essentially tells you how to translate Yang into CBOR. And in that process, what you do is you actually map the big long Yang names, which work very nicely in JSON. You map them to small integers, and that's how it works. We have a request, which I find still bizarre, but I'm not going to argue with it, to sign the smaller CBOR vouchers using CMS. So let's make the inner content really small with CBOR and then sign it with something kind of big. It's a bit bizarre to me, but the argument is that the code is already there because you've run DTLS. So that's why they want to do that. And also that I think it has also to do with that certain communities are not very familiar with cryptographic operations to begin with, and they're just getting to know CMS, and to tell them to do something else again would be just too weird. We also would like to sign with COSI. That's new in terms of it's something we don't do in the current voucher document where it is CMS. And of course, we would like to have the voucher operations in the EST. Next slide, please. Who's going to use it? Right now, Fair Hair, which is a lighting consortium for building control, very much wants to do this kind of stuff, and they want to do it in there. Essentially, they're building they intend to build an ACP between their lighting controllers. And if you want to think about what's happening, the building owns the ACP and controls all the lighting controllers, and the tenants control the light switches. The tenants are the actual end users, as it were, of the network, and they get a network that has light switches to turn lights on and off. But the building controller owners control the controllers through the ACP. Obviously, there's the zero touch work that's happening in 6TISH, and the retail lighting, like the Philips Hue, apparently would like to do this. Next slide. The MASA doesn't really change much. It still speaks HTTP with the registrar. It has to learn to create constrained vouchers. So in other words, it needs to create a different kind of data object. But although the end device will receive it over COAP, the MASA would send it over HTTPS just as it is, because this just stays as a cloud resource the same way as it was before. Next slide. So the JRC is the thing that really changes the most. Okay, so that's the join registrar and coordinator. So it still speaks, there's a lot of different connections here. It still speaks to the MASA, as I said, with HTTPS. It still speaks to the CA backend using whatever protocol that CA wants to talk to. It's out of scope for us. And but now it receives these green connections, which are going to be over CoAP and going to be through some other kind of proxy mechanism. So IP/IP is still a possibility. With CoAP, you can build a stateless CoAP because you can proxy. With unencrypted CoAP, you can build a stateless proxy because you can actually put extra data into the thing to get it back. So that works with ad hoc. And we don't have a good solution for CoAP over DTLS proxying unless it's IP/IP. And we're actually having a conversation whether we can reuse the proxy that the thread people created. And it's very difficult because the document is hard to obtain. And I know several people for which they were unable to get they were unable to click through it because their lawyer wouldn't let them. And there's actually a lot of parts. So it's looking like a less and less good idea to make it in common with them. There's also the Atlas working group. So whereas ad hoc puts your security above CoAP into the application layer, there's also an attempt to do the same thing where you put TLS above CoAP. So that would be ad hoc, and that could be supported as well if you wanted to. But what we're really talking about in this document is the fact that you have vouchers that are constrained. Not everyone is going to go through and do an enrollment with EST. Some constrained networks want to do that, and other constrained networks want to just get a network key, which they're going to rekey with. And so the relationship, the trusted relationship between the pledge and the JRC that allows the pledge to join the network may be an ongoing relationship that they keep alive for the duration of the network. Next slide, please. So in our document, we have a couple of issues. The document's actually progressed a great deal in the last month. If you've read it more than a month ago, you probably want to read it again. It absorbed much of the EST extensions that were in the ACE document. And we have an ongoing since December back and forth with the guys doing, and the core working group doing the SID mechanisms. Essentially, because of the way that we do the Yang, that we derive things, there's two different ways in which the SIDs could be assigned. They could be assigned uniquely for a voucher and voucher request, and that would be a different SID value for the same name, or they could be the same. They could be the same value because it's really the same object, but actually in two different containers. And so that's a bit weird in some ways, but they're going to resolve that. Next slide, please. So here's an example. To do things well, there's a parent SID. It's a 3-byte CBOR number or more. There's an allocation mechanism. It's a website you can go to get your own group of 50 SID numbers. So that starts as a number, and then we have positive integers to basically as deltas. So they work out as 1 byte, and then you have the data in there. In fact, I've shown the date that way, but it's quoted, but that's wrong. It actually would be a CBOR date object. And then a bunch of things that content. So you can see on the right-hand side, those are the created on, expires on, assertion serial number, IDEV ID issue. Those are all things that should be familiar if you've read the voucher document. Delta, yes. And then we can sign this in a CMS content, or we can sign it with COSI. Next slide, please. No, that's it? Oh, okay. I had another slide. No, I don't think so. I guess that was it. I thought I had questions. It's okay. Now, at this point, questions.
You pointed me someplace to this wonderful Hilton Dungeon-like map of all the relationship between the different drafts in this whole bootstrap thingy. So that are you planning to have that in some document for eternity? Right. Because I think it would help a lot. Because
would you like to? I might be able to pull it up for you quickly if you want to. If you want to go to the right wiki.
No, I'm not sure how easy that is here now with a desktop involved. But
so I have posted a number of times. I have a document that is called enrollment roadmap, and it kind of takes all the boxes and the different columns together, and it's unclear at this point where it belongs or what it belongs to. But it has 5 boxes, one of which is Anima, one of which is netconf, one of which is 6tish, or 2 of which is 6tish, and then has a new one which is been created in the middle. Right now, it's in the IoT Directorate wiki, because that's where people thought it belonged, and it's not a document at all. And about a third of the document just says this document is in working group X, and this document has no home, and stuff like that. So we just keep track of as much which pieces don't have homes as which pieces do. This is one of the pieces that do not have a home as yet.
Well, if you manage to do the SVG thing, then I don't really like to promote it, but then I think it would be a lot easier to have it as kind of a framework draft to point to the other things, and I think that might even be appropriate. For
I'm really not opposed to that at all. I just don't know what working group or group is going to do anything with it, or whether anything should happen to it. I think, as you said, for the previous documents, the document we want to publish as slowly as possible.
That's certainly true, right? But I'm saying that given how the stuff started in Anima, kind of explaining the framework of where it, the work trickled over through to other groups might still be a good Anima framework document.
Well, in a moment, I'll post the URL in the Jabber channel, so if you can see it. But you had a question, Max?
Hi, Max Bergen. On the discussion of the signing format, the current draft is empty on the COSE format, and I'm asking the question with trepidation as to whether or not the issue is that people just don't understand the COSE format and haven't generated the text for that and thus don't have anything to read to compare against, or whether there's actually pushback saying they don't want the COSE format.
I would say there's actual pushback that says essentially, I don't want to introduce a new crypto library to my system right now. I have one in my DTLS stack, and it can do CMS.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No, I'll find the URL quickly.
I have a question for the agenda here. There is, at the end of the scheduled time is the discussion around the short lifetime certificates, and I'm asking if that could be moved up if you have time to do so. It would be a short readout on what happened in the dispatch. It's just a question. Can you move it up? Yeah, sure. After this.
Okay, this has been again talking about the bulk data transport over GRASP. Next, please. Next, please. We just reused GRASP negotiation message as a transport protocol between client and in a client-server approach. And the communication model is a little bit different than an original GRASP negotiation message because it will require some asymmetric approaches. And the goal of the draft is not to promote GRASP as a very decent transport protocol, but rather it is for your convenience. If you only need to do some information to be transported on your hand, then you can just use a GRASP. So this is not for a better performance or better security or whatever. It is just for simplification. Next. Some updates since last IETF. We emphasize that it is for your convenience. It's not for performance. We don't want to replace FTP or TFTP, etc. And we also have some minor technical clarifications. And if one ISA needs simultaneous transfers, it is separated in different GRASP negotiation sessions. Next, please. So there are still some open issues. The first one is the MTU issue, because in GRASP, the MTU is limited to 2,000. And whether it's a problem for some transport scenario is still an open question. And what's the use case in what kind of situation people want to use GRASP as a transport protocol? And maybe we also need to define some dedicated API other than the GRASP synchronization API for bug transfer. And whether this draft is for your information or maybe a potential standard track. These are some open issues. I think that's all. Any question, comments?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the one of the obvious use case is, try to if they try to do the document transfer for the devices update. Say if the certain devices need to update the software on that devices to next version or fix some bugs. So this could be a potential protocol to use. So looks for me there are some definitely useful use case, but I'm not sure why you have the MTU as 2000 at the very beginning. Why? I mean, where did the 2000 come from?
It's at the very beginning of GRASP. It is basically for the convenience of parsing the GRASP message. Because unaware it's zeroed by CBOL. So when it receives the message, it don't need to pass the CBOL, the CBOL serial. So it can identify what's the end of the message. It's for the convenience.
Why it become an issue now? I don't understand here, because if you exceed the MTU, it just get another package.
There used to be some discussion on the mailing list. If I recall correctly, it was raised by Joe Happen, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact details, but from my own understanding, 2000 maybe sometimes is not very efficient, especially when you just transfer very small pieces. So it's not flexible.
No, that's the maximum, not the overhead. I mean, let's take this on the mailing list, technically discussing. Any more questions from the room? Comments? Okay. Thanks, B.
Thank you.
Max, you said you want to be next. You this one?
Thank you for adjusting the schedule. We have another presentation next door, so I'm trying to bounce it back and forth. So this was just presented in the Security Dispatch Working Group discussion. So there is timeliness here in the conversation in that they just talked about this, and I'll try and sync the two up. But I do recommend, while I threw these slides together, I'm not the author on the draft, and They have a set of slides that they presented in Security Dispatch, so I do recommend looking for those if you're interested in it.
This screen.
Thank you. So predominantly what they're talking about here is use cases regarding when you would do a short-term certificate and why. And in particular, if you look at the draft, they talk about autonomic and ANI as the largest body of text within their current draft, although the authors themselves are not familiar with ANIMA. And when they presented their slides, they presented a slide about ANIMA, but then said, we have nothing to say about it because they don't know anything about ANIMA. The other use cases they brought up most consistently was around data centers and basic environments that are not the web. And the conversation within Security Dispatch essentially went around this question of whether short lifetime certificates would be appropriate for the web, as in lots of folks came up to the mic and said, hey, this should be talked about even in that use case. So the predominant sentiment in the room, I might say, was that they should consider expanding their scope even though they were trying to limit it. There is, of course, a lot of value in saying, let's just pick with a limited scope. The general question here is around the idea that there's a bunch of code to support revocation, whether it's serial distribution points or OCSP or et cetera, and that code is the most dangerous code in the world, is the kind of body of code. And the more code is in there that's run infrequently or run with lots of options, the harder it is to get everything right. And there's certainly a lot of simplicity that can be achieved by just simply cutting a bunch of it out. And so by getting rid of all those edge conditions, you end up with something a little bit cleaner, a little bit simpler. Next slide. So if you look at the draft, Section 4 is a series of these operational considerations of what they do. The lifetime and renewal conversation, there's a couple of discussions in there about Brewski. They're referencing our documents, and their lack of knowledge in that space is clear. They mix up a couple of things, but effectively what they're saying is between Brewski and EST and ACME that it is possible to automatically distribute these certificates as needed in keeping them up to date. So this is, they're standing on our shoulders, even if they haven't understood quite how we're standing up yet. And they're talking about certificates in just a very short lifetime, which is very similar to what we've done with our vouchers and other things. So it is very consistent with our vision. There is an availability of the CA conversation because, of course, the CA now has to be stood up all the time and ready to respond. In our use cases in ANIMA and in data centers and other things in general, this makes total sense and is reasonable for us. It was that web scenario that they had a conversation about because you want to have a CA that's maybe offline or has restrictions to help protect the private keys on it, and then you would have a different key for your OCSP responder. And so there's some push in the room to make sure that they cover those use cases. The general statement they're making, which is almost exactly the statement that we've made within the voucher documents within our work, is that this is really no different than having an OCSP server minus those minor key issues. They do talk about clock skew as an issue and addressing that, which we've talked about a lot. In the Brewski conversation, we use nonces and we avoided clock issues during bring up, but we then do have a clock which we worry about for certificate validity. And what they're really just saying here is that you have to make sure that clock is in sync, but I think we have that problem anyway, and you have that problem with OCSP. So that's a no-op for us, I believe. Certificate transparency is an issue because you are now generating multiple certificates at a much higher rate. And so you have to go and log all that stuff. And part of the reason why they wanted to avoid the web use case and talk about just ANIMA or data center is because certificate transparency isn't as used in our use cases. It makes sense for us. Next slide. And so the other point I want to make is this all just dovetails right off of where we are with Brewski, which is to say short-lived, don't do revocation, go get a new one, expect your server, in this case the master server, to be up and running so that you can do that. And all they're really just saying here is that the ANIMA CA would be always on and always available to issue new certificates to the devices. to me, this just makes all of our ANIMA work simpler and cuts out edge conditions. So I think this is really good. And like I said, it's a repeat of essentially the exact same argument we made for vouchers. So I think it's very much in line with our stuff. The conclusion in the security dispatch working meeting next door was that they are going to recommend that this work go to the LAMP working group, which, as was commented, is a might be an adjustment to the charter for LAMP. So we're not sure how that'll go out, but that's their role, is to decide where to put it. And I have no idea whether anybody here thinks differently, but if you have concerns, bring it up with that conversation, or at least be aware that that's what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have no kind of overview about the right working group for this draft overall. So let's figure that out, and let's take offline your feedback on the details so that we can fix the draft up. For me, and that goes back to the last time we had the discussion, the simple things just for not even Brewski, but for the EST renewal, that basically by simply modifying the expectation against the lifetime, that the EST renewal would, still accept an LDEF ID after it has expired, whereas, for actual services, you can't use it anymore, would be a simple way to increase the stability of short-lived vouchers. And that was where I was still looking for the right place or document where that could be added as a semantic. And I think last time you said you were thinking about that, and I haven't seen a feedback on that one.
So, I'm not sure exactly what your question is there, because you conflated the voucher conversation.
No, exactly. I'm saying not even the voucher, right? So I think there is the big difference between how easy is it to have, especially in a lot of constrained or otherwise, more security protected environments, very often vouchers reissued, and whether vendors would like that, right? So that's where I was saying that once you have gone through the voucher phase, maybe it's just a matter of making for short-lived certificates the renewal easier, so that even if the certificate has expired, the EST renewal itself would still work, because you're still accepting on the TLS EST connection the expired LDEF ID.
The recommendation in the short-lived certificate draft as it exists today is to do a renewal at about halfway through the lifetime of the certificate.
Right.
And I believe that's consistent with the language we have in EST and in our use of it. But
I'm talking about the arrows that, right? The shorter you make the lifetime, the higher the risk that you have an issue. And then especially if you can't get a voucher again because of the type of deployment case, that's basically when the modification of extending the recognition of the LDEF ID for the EST renewal itself would be the easy way out, unless somebody shows that there is really...
And they do indicate that in their draft, and it would be useful for us because it would allow us to move to that model as fully specified. Right now, there is no place where that's been specified because it is a PKIX change, and that's why the recommendation to move this to LAMP makes sense, because that's limited editions.
So you think that basically the goal should be that this modification of the semantic of the expiry lifetime, in terms of you can extend the validity of the certificate for the purpose of renewal, that, something like even standards track, introducing this could be done through this draft. We wouldn't need another one.
They would do it in the short lifetime certificate draft, is where they would indicate that. And we would have to make sure that as they do that indication, it clearly and properly references the EST specifications that we are also using, and make sure that happens. So we'll have to be engaged in that. But I wouldn't recommend that we actually change our language around it.
No, of course not. No. I mean, it was. I think the goal was to find the right place. In the first place, I thought this document would just explain the whole solution, but if it could become the normative place to have that, even better so.
Exactly, yes.
Michael Richardson. So I just quickly scanned the document you pointed at, and I guess the thing that they get wrong is that they believe that we have specified short-lived certificates when we've specified short-lived vouchers in our document. That's their mistake that you're referring to.
Exactly, and I will work with them to
and that's great. So, but what it sounds to me that as you just said, the document will go somewhere, they'll do something. Sounds to me that the right approach for us is in the future to write a BCP on operations of the ACP, and that it could refer to this option of short-lived certificates rather than OCSP. Ironically, of course, the ACP makes the OCSP much more reliable and available. So in some sense, it's it's relevant for everyone else except us, right?
Yeah, so maybe my point on that is that the actual Brewski mechanism, right, given if you fail, right, if your certificate expires, right, then the fact we can still use the Brewski proxy, even though we're just doing EST renewal, and we couldn't do that across the ACP anymore because our short-lived certificate expired, right? So
I see.
that is basically the cool thing for ourselves.
So I would say that, again, that probably belongs in operational document that says, you know, you could do that. This is a recommendation, and I really think we should save that for actually if we have some experience.
Right. But we need the kind of the normative place that, you know, then ultimately the security review in the IETF agrees on that for renewal operation, an expired certificate is still valid, right? So that's the big improvement. Then we can do all this great.
Yes, and I think that language is there, but I agree with your sentiment that we need to write at least an informational discussion right now as to how this would affect us so that we can better manage that conversation with whatever work they come up with.
Sure, okay. Anyway, LAMPS probably is the right place for that to happen, and I think we can participate with that. So.
Right. And I think your point is that we should write something that makes sure that we understand how this impacts us. It could be best practices right now, but
well, actually, I'm suggesting we write nothing right now.
Okay.
Well, that we let them go ahead and write a document and contribute to it, and that at the end of the day, they either, as you just said, will have updated EST to say something, and then it's just like it can be pointed to. Yeah. But at a future point, someone may write a BCP about best practices for operating your ACP, right? And it could say that the movement to shorter term certificates with regular renewals is a good thing in the following 12 environments, and there are 2 environments where it doesn't work, right? And many of our offline kind of air gap things and whatever, maybe one of those places where actually you do need 30-year certificates with CRLs that are signed every year, right?
But I think the other part also is that I think most of the other co-authors came from, data center and other environments where we don't really, have, I think right now a good starting point for the ACP, but educating that, you can still rely on Brewski and EST with this changed semantic to very simply have also a non-ANI, just Brewski, deployment case for short-lived certificates that are fully autonomically, renewed. I think that's even more expanding, I think, the deployment into those spaces where we haven't, I think, made progress so far.
Agreed. Yes.
Thank you. Next will be Alex.
Alex? You're next.
Thank you. I will use this time slot to describe a bit how the current draft could move forward, but also as a way to better deploy all, if not all, most of the current ANIMA technologies. Please go next. As I understand it, as a basis of work in ANIMA is a concept of an autonomic node, which could be put together in a form of a network, and then everything else is defined. The control plane, all the others. I'm afraid this is good, but not good enough, because there are very few of such things around. And anybody wants to add some capabilities to the existing nodes all over the place will face the fact that this is very costly. And sometimes people ask, even if it's costly and it's easy to implement, what for is for? So it's a time maybe to rethink about what are the exact area where you could apply much easily ANIMA as a whole. I'm promoting the fact that it's a time to move in line with what is now called particular type of sub-networks, which are called slices, which are emerging and emerging as a commercial reality as well as a research and development reality. And to apply or try to readjust ANIMA to this environment, that means to move to practically from existing resources, which are physical resources, towards virtual resources, namely also network functions. And it's time to move in a form of virtual networks as well as slices, because that's where potentially ANIMA technology could be first applied and used. That means that also the bootstrapping, the control plane, and as well as the grasp, which is a very nice protocol, have to be readjusted to move to this environment. And anyway, slices will happen anyway. It's an opportunity to adjust it before too late. Next slide. Everything which I said before, namely is that at the end of the day, the unit of work in ANIMA is exemplifying this nice diagram, which says that at the bottom you have the domains based on autonomic nodes, and all the other infrastructure which are defined in ANIMA are above. Although this is an excellent assumption, but it's not very practical also from another point of view. Autonomicity is not one item. It's made of many self-X capabilities, X being any management functions. And there are thousands of such things. If you take the first few, you get at least some self-X priorities which need to be customized for. Second, this issue is not only a single domain, it's multi-domain end-to-end. So that when you add these complexities to it, the question is it ANIMA as it is now easy to deploy? I think that's a time to move a bit towards the way this could be much easier to be deployed. And I'm once again argue that it's a time to piggyback on the big activities called network slicing, which is basically sub-networks of a particular kind, which are dynamically created, but for a purpose of supporting a service. It's not a generic network. Second, please move on.
Since you just mentioned the multi-domain, personally, I'm fine with that. That's in my ambitions to be able to handle the multi-domain issues. But the reality is, up to now, the ANIMA is based on the assumption we are working in a single domain. So I'm afraid there are a lack of some fundamental supporting to do multi-domain in ANIMA working group. I'm fine with you has that in your vision, but probably we need to do something to match the fundamental support for multi-domain or cross-domain issues before we can talking about the end-to-end slicing. Yeah, just a comment.
That's a very good comment. But from the positive point of view, multi-domain issues is a norm now for operators, and for management. Therefore, why not to you constrain too much to a single domain?
Sure.
Although multi-domain could add a lot of other features or capabilities which need to be customized. That's a complexity to be added, but still, it's possible.
Yeah.
Now, I'll go quickly to the fact that slicing are now a reality in a sense of being probably driven by commercial realities in many ways. But one aspect of slicing which is absolutely essential for ANIMA is the fact that you can conceive them as it is defined as internal slices, something which is under full control of the operators, but provided to a tenant to use, or the tenant has additional management controls, including autonomic capabilities on it, which are if you wanted, under obviously supervision of the operator. And that means that there are ways to add more autonomicity, if you want, management to slice management in order for tenant to take advantage of it or not. And this is now accepted as part of it. This is another way to allow ANIMA technology to piggyback in this form, which may mean to have some additional interfaces to allow tenants to take advantage of it, as well as maybe operators to deliver it. Next slide. Sorry, a question.
Bing Liu, a response to Shen's question. I think ideally, the autonomic network slicing can do among multiple domains. But if we limit ANIMA technology into one single domain, I think this is also doable. We just let the orchestration level to separate the slicing requirement into different domains, and then the ANIMA only handle the requirements or the actions within that domain. Thanks.
Yeah, that will make it easier for the current ANIMA to accept such things. Yeah.
Okay, in my next set of slides, I will just point out further work which need to be done in order to make, if you want, ANIMA technology as a whole or parts of it slice aware. Not all the work is completed in this draft, but it will continue. This simple diagrammatical form says that at the end of the day, slices are a combination of network resources put together dynamically, together with some network functions for a purpose of supporting of a service. And you can have many such slices in a network. It's still not clear how many you can properly define, but the whole purpose of it is to allow a sub-network being customized for a service properly. And that means that there are the mechanism of creating them, to manage them, to deploy them, and so on. It's outside of the ANIMA working group, but it's a time for ANIMA to take advantage of it, which may mean that some additional interface and capability for different infrastructure part of ANIMA may be useful things to be developed further. Thank you. Next. Just to restate that actually, to some extent, autonomicity and automation are key requirements for network slicing. It is inconceivable to create millions of such things if these capabilities are not deployed. It's a time to take advantage of this or to piggyback on this activity. And to some extent, this could be quite easily done through the extension of the ANIMA technologies. Another point is that it's a time to go above the issue of centralized or logically centralized management approaches for doing that. It's a time to go for full distribution in order to take advantage of the multi-domain and end-to-end issues. And this could be performed if new capabilities are added to some of the ANIMA drafts. One of it is not to assume that the whole autonomicity functionality is applicable, but to customize it for specific sets of self-X functions. Obviously, this could be specialized for a particular slice. For other slices will be different. And that help a bit with, in my view, with first of all, separating logically the autonomic behavior from the physical underlying network resources, but also take advantage of it to make it easy or easier, in my view, deployability, which is probably a good objectives. Next slide. So a number of issues need to be looked at in terms of augmenting either the assumptions or some of the issues related to different parts of ANIMA. First of all, is to embrace virtual environment. You cannot do it without it. And obviously, this could be done in many ways, but this it is important. There is also a need to look at signal interaction between these sub-networks, and also to add other capabilities related to composition and deletion of different parts and functionality in the sub-networks autonomicity. Then there are other important points. It's a time maybe to focus on few specialized, as they were defined in the last 10 years, autonomic capabilities, namely self-configuration, self-monitoring, self-optimization, self-elasticity, which will be also key to put it in place. A generic autonomic system, in my view, will have a very long time to be accepted. So it's better to concentrate on this part. The last point is not as dedicated, it's dedicated information. It is not practical, in my view, to move towards this area without some level of information models, which will be the basis for sort of information distribution, aggregation, and storage, which is part of the environment, in order to make it customized for this particular situation, namely slices. Next, please. Or I have a question.
I don't really understand why you need any augmentation at all. My name is Michael Richardson. As far as we spent a fair bit of time making sure that all of the bits in ANIMA were capable of supporting virtualizing platforms, that we could have additional nodes inside of, or virtual nodes, virtual machines inside of nodes could participate in ANIMA. And as far as I can see, if using the physical layer ANIMA, you build a ACP in a network, and then you put up a bunch of virtual routers on top of that with virtual links between them, that there's no reason you can't run another instance of ANIMA if the customer wants to run their own autonomic network on top of that. Yes, there are some interfaces that you need to be able to configure new virtual interfaces below. So the upper customer, if he wants to have new interfaces plugged in from place to place, he needs a new connection. But that's in the space of some customized ASA. To me, it's not a core architectural issue with ANIMA. So you've asked for what I see on this slide, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you said here's a bunch of new requirements for ANIMA, and I'm not seeing anything new here, is what I'm trying to say.
I do understand what you said, by the way.
Yeah.
I sympathize with what you're saying, but with due respect, I disagree with you.
Okay, good.
Now let me give you the other side. A slide is not just a network. It is a service network. In other words, the combination between a service and the network resource is a unit.
Yeah.
Now, if you decouple, say, I need ANIMA or any other network technology on one side and service on the other side, it is a classical way to handle today. This is not the case for slices. Therefore, at the end of the day, the creation of a slice with capability, autonomic capability, and using them, it is different to just having virtual networks. It has to have additionally, very importantly, some services or service functions together. So that's a new.
I'm understanding that. What I see is as an ASA that implements network slicing, and I don't see that as a core extension to ANIMA. I see this as a very interesting ASA, which could do a lot of really interesting things. And I actually think we have we've failed to actually come up with really interesting ASAs, and you just come up with a really good one.
Yeah,
right.
Maybe, but let me give you another aspect. As soon as you move to this slicing or virtual environment, you have suddenly the issue of scale. A lot of virtual machines, not a few thousand, maybe a few millions. And this scale dictates to be a bit more refined in terms of the control plane. You cannot do it for all of them. So it's a time to think a bit more carefully on this. Maybe it's not new. Indeed, virtualization is older than networking anyway in historical terms. But I think that this aspect requires additional attention to make it properly used.
Okay.
That's
Well,
my
read your
argument.
I'm going to read your document, but I'm not convinced at this point that there's anything new here that we haven't already taken advantage. I think there's some really interesting applications, but it seems to me like it's a requirements on an ASA, not on any of the core pieces of ANIMA. And I'll read your document again and I'll write some email to say what I think.
I have some more slides about other parts, other requirements, not only on ASA. But I have to say that I sympathize with what you're saying, but I think it's a time to move forward rather than to say that ASA is good for every, it's fit all type of arguments. I'm not convinced of that either.
Yeah, Xing, as a contributor. I'm with Michael. Actually, this is a very good, use case for ASA, but it may not be a normal ASA if that's something a function could be shared along multiple ASA. That could become something generic. Then it may get down to some more fundamental stuff to be able to, handle by the ANIMA working group. But before that, I'm thinking, maybe you should make this more in generic way, like something virtual resource management. Then that maybe in a better shape to be adopted by other ASAs. Then that makes sense. We may do that.
Okay.
So, Thomas, I'm still trying to figure out, what the most simple instances are explaining this work for somebody who would want to code something that actually runs. And so if I think about the ACP and, I'm building a slice and that consists of virtual machines across a bunch of devices. And I'm saying, I want to have, for this virtual network an ACP to manage it in the same way that we, currently are doing it for the physical network. Then the question is how am I building the ACP? If I understood Michael correctly, he was saying this could be done through ASAs. That is true, but I think, amount of choices we have to build that type of ACP is a lot larger when it's a virtual context. I mean, the question has to be raised, why wouldn't an SDN controller be able to do it? Because, you already have that, and you already have the connectivity into all these devices, right? On the physical ASA that we're building so far, we had to, there was a really strong case to do it autonomically because you didn't have the connectivity. You first had to bring up the devices, you built that. If you do it for a virtual context, I think we need to, find the good deployment operation on other cases to do it autonomically through an ASA instead of an SDN controller. And scale can be one reason, but again, I think that, there is a lot larger scale in data centers for a context. A slice in a service provider network, I still haven't seen reasonable expectation if there would be more than 5 or 6 slices. I'm just, I'd be happy to get the answers like we have the scale, we have the requirements to do it in ASAs, but I think those requirements need to be really well worked out. Otherwise, we're again running against the wall of, hey, I'm going to solve everything from a controller, which I think is an option, and we need to just show that our, ASA option would be equally or better.
Yeah, just a comment on what you said. Yeah, I fully understand what you say and agree. But just to point out that the current networks are not all SDN enabled. And potentially autonomicity and has to be applicable to other situations. It's a time maybe to embrace networking and services together. And this is the plea. That's rather than saying that. But customization of the control plane for this purpose, it is a proposition which has to be made, but also some customization of a grasp, and other few things which may be easily to do in order to embrace this part.
Bob
Thank you.
Moskowitz, HT Consulting. I was part of the 802.1ar document writing. When we conceived the concept of the IDEV and the LDEV, we explicitly saw the need for multiple levels and service use of LDEV. That was in our initial design considerations. I have worked on implementations of PKI in the millions of devices. Yes, that deployment speed has been traditionally been slow, but some of the things being looked at, particularly in the automotive arena, where there's going to be need for fairly fast deployment of hundreds of millions of certificates. We are looking that the scale is not an issue, that there's nothing to really to limit. Hardware exists to do the operations and the rest at speed necessary for scaling up to that size. It's an interesting use case, one that definitely needs to be looked at, but to me, it is just one more use case that fits well within the framework, both of 802.1ar and the framework of ANIMA. And it is the challenge of saying that network slicing services will use this model and look at the demands of scaling, but they're used to demands of scaling issues, and throw what's necessary at them. So be fun to watch this and to pitch in where needed. But like I said, I have personally worked with up to the tens of millions of certificates in PKI. So I know that they exist already today.
Very good comment. I wish I could answer to you very carefully and properly. The only thing which I want to add is that the needs for network slicing are dictated by the use cases in a 5G environment. There are around 20 or 30, and they are driving the whole industry to make it happen. And there are no equivalent push for ANIMA to do the same. So it's not that network slicing people will use ANIMA. It's a time to do it a bit in the next period, to do it together. Otherwise, there will be a mismatch in 2 years.
Yeah.
That's a sort of a marketing answer to your question. Technically, you're right. Maybe in some parts, there is no need to have such a large scale of scalability, but I can argue from the other side that there is a need. And once you do this, suddenly some of the assumptions could be a little bit changed in order to make it more applicable. That's what I'm pleading for.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Shall we move on?
Yeah, please.
You have another 5-6 minutes.
Okay, I'll move very quickly to the next, move on about this, because this is, because it's probably well known, although this is a bit of grasp applicability to this environment of slicing. Next. Few things which are important to extend are related to the fact that, and this is an answer to some of one of the early questions, is that in addition to the topology resources, virtual topologies, there is a need to add network function and service functions in the environment, including monitoring, configuration, and quality of service and self-escala capabilities in order to create a subnetwork on which ANIMA applies to. This is not yet defined. Actually, it will be better that what is called ANIMA autonomic node or network is defined. How do you describe it? Otherwise, you cannot apply to anything. So it's a bit to make it a bit more prescriptive, and this is clearly needed. Obviously, it's a time also to look at some way in which you could allow this capability to be extended, shrinked, configured, destroyed, and obviously self-X in terms of composition, configuration, and particular monitoring and others to be applied to. So this is like a slightly different use cases or requirements or actually real functionality which has to be added to ACP and a few grasp and few others. Next slide. this is a shopping list for things to be a little bit added to GRASP in order to make it applicable here. Maybe not a complete list, but I put it forward, and I'm not going to go through it. It's in the draft, but it shows that it's not directly applicable. And some additional work has to be done. One item which I mentioned before is that there is an interplay between a tenant and this subnetwork owner, which is an operator. The interface between the two and the way in which this will be negotiated in terms of using information and others, this is important. This is potentially missing. It's like an additional element to make ANIMA a bit more applicable. The customers of ANIMA are not defined. I'm just arguing that the tenants of these slices would become a good candidate for being customers. Therefore, offering capabilities to them for more or less control or management, it will be a useful things to do. Next, please. Obviously, there are some other elements which could be added to GRASP. And this slide focuses on such a thing, in particular, how you trigger and govern and coordinate elasticity, i.e. to bring more resources or less resources in the subnetwork without interrupting the service. Is this a control plane issue? Yes. It is a signaling and message information exchange issue? Yes. But without this, then you have a static applicability of the network, and this is not anymore the current situation. Next, please. So I'll just conclude. In addition to the draft, which has a shopping list of issues to be worked out, talking to my colleagues, I think that's the time to split this into maybe separate items to be more concrete if you want. But at the end of the day, this is a plea to piggyback on the current emerging but substantial, much bigger than ANIMA work in terms of commercial research and development work on slicing, which is mainly about 5G, as potentially the best way to increase the deployability of all the aspects so far without changing all of them, but a bit adapting them. That concludes my simple presentation about it. Thank you.
Yeah, may I make just one comment here? You know, I can candidly say, you know, I like your shopping list, but that's not the way, you know, how our IETF working group work. You know, you should come, not just tell us this is your shopping list, but you should, you know, come to bring a detailed solution, you know, give us something, maybe it's implementable. Then we can discuss whether the solution is good or not, whether you know this meets certain requirements technically or not. Now, you know, you just give us a shopping list. In principle, I would like, you know, your shopping list and say somebody in this room would do that. I'm not sure. We don't as a IETF working group, we all individuals, we don't have resource to just, you know, to produce something, you know, by the working group for your shopping list. So we actually expect you to give us detailed solutions.
Yeah, I fully agree. Actually, in the draft, there are some. But
right,
I highlighted here more issues about the fact that...
You should talk about those solutions, yeah, you know, not only your shopping list.
Fine. Yeah.
Hi, Elliot Lear. I think what you're talking about are next steps, right? In terms of how you might evolve what you've started in a draft into very specific protocol proposals, and which one of those would have uptake in the group and which ones perhaps do not. In terms of you can test them individually. I think it's a perfectly reasonable comment for the chair to have made in terms of, you know, leading you into that discussion. I think that's actually an excellent point of discussion for now.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So next will be Terrace. Yeah, that's you. Yeah. DSSD. You have 10 minutes. 10 minutes, no more.
Okay. Next slide. All right, so quick reminder of the background. So this originally started out when, a bunch of the, flexibility options we wanted to have for discovery for what we needed in the ANI, EST and Brewski or so became too much for the standards track documents, Brewski and ACP, and then I started to write up how to more generally map the DNSSD attributes and add to it what we could do even more than DNSSD into something that applications for GRASP, any application GRASP could reuse. I showed that in the technical details in Anima, but there was, I think, an even more useful discussion about this in DNSSD working group on Wednesday at IETF101. It was well received, and also the concept that we've done in terms of, just don't simply take a bloody MDNS packet and put it into GRASP and be happy, but rather really having a native exposure of the attributes and trying to map them accordingly was well received. Brian Carpenter also built a prototype for GRASP, verifying that the proposed formatting works. And so even though there is no update or 01 in terms of any details, it seemed to be already in fairly good shape. So I wanted to quickly just talk about the strategy, what I would like to achieve with this. Next slide. So again, as I said, right, so the core part was the ANI ACP use case themselves. So in terms of as soon as we would have this draft out, then basically you have more flexibility options in the announcement for registrar's EST service within the ACP itself. But even more so, and this is basically the stuff that I didn't show last time at Anima, but that I discussed in DNSSD, where we're coming from is really the fact that in the stable connectivity use case, we're having a NOC and we're having an ACP. The most simple way to really bring them together is to have, all the network devices in the ACP automatically discover all those services that they typically have to configure manually, which is kind of a syslog server, time server, netconf server, DHCP server. We got anything that you can think of with the word server, which is typically what today you configure a long list of IP addresses, then you figure out what happens when these fail, and you configure 2 IP addresses, and then when these fail, you have to reapply. And anyhow, I think you get the point that this is really the classical way on how to bring today an ANI network with a NOC together very easily. So that's basically what I really wanted to achieve in the stable connectivity. Next slide. So I would like to write another draft sitting on this, which would really be a small normative draft as part of the example use case, which is the stable connectivity, right? So the current draft, which is in the RFC editor queue, describes the framework, the goal, the overall, and basically to me, the most simple starting point to really say, okay, you have an ANI, you want to use it for stable connectivity. Here is basically the services that you already have in your network equipment, the list up front. Here are basically the most of them already have DNSSD service names. This is basically what you need to do to connect an existing NOC with all these services together, and that of course would refer to this draft, right? And that was basically for me kind of a good closure for the stable connectivity use case to really show how to first deploy an ANI with a NOC, and that's really only about the service discovery of these things. So, yep. And then basically the normative question, or the kind of what happens if we're really just discovering all these services, and you have something like, I don't know, a Radius client, a syslog client or so, and it uses GRASP to discover that. Does that make the client an ASA? I mean, it's a hypothetical question, right? I don't really care because I'm just only interested in the functionality. But if you want to call them ASAs, we could, I think, because they're already using then the ACP. They're using GRASP to discover the service, and the rest is just existing functionality. Next slide. Right, so there might be other things to do with this, which I'm not really that interested in right now from an Anima perspective. There are a bunch of, hybrid MDNS, DNSSD solutions. So Brian and I discussed whether we might want to propose also just using a GRASP domain as a transit. But again, this is below the line for me. Next slide. So really, for me, the first step would be, getting feedback, opinions, and I would like to hereby officially ask, for a working group adoption of this draft.
Hey, Turles.
Hey.
Elliot, again. Can you go back to slide 3, please? Slide 3 had a lengthy list of things one might want to get in terms of what things people might want to discover. Let's put the DHCP server aside for the moment.
Yeah.
But a lot of those things look an awful lot like, I'm not sure what you mean by IP fix there in terms of your NetFlow collector. But
the collector, you're discovering the collector where you should send to.
So there's a related effort that's going on in the DHC working group. I just wanted to bring to your attention, which is that they're in the process of taking the DHCP options and Yangifying them. And it may be that there's some way you can leverage that mechanism in terms of not having to respecify all of the discovery formats and things like that. I'm not saying you should do this. I'm just saying you should be aware of it, and it may be something useful for the work.
Yeah. So in my past experience, and I certainly, if you can ping me with the draft names if I don't find them myself. In my past experience, DNSSD already has, good libraries, also Grasp. We can have a simple library that basically server in the NOC uses to announce itself with a few parameters. And I'm not aware of any really good, simple, lightweight alternative with DHCP, right? The way you do it with DHCP is a lot more, manual configuration on servers. So I don't think it's the most autonomic approach.
I don't mean that you should use DHCP as the mechanism.
Right.
However, the Yangification of the parameters formats can save you a little bit of time in terms of maybe what you really just need is an encoding rule from one to the other, and it can save you a lot of time as you tackle that list, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, I agreed.
Michael Richardson here. I think Elliot definitely has a very good point. I actually think some of this stuff could really be killer app for a lot of stuff, for a lot of places. Getting machines configured for syslog when they're otherwise kind of not autonomously. They have local administrators, right, and who with local rights, and they regularly don't, set up a bunch of these things because they don't think about it. Getting that kind of stuff happening, I think that would be a really killer app for a lot of things, and particularly in a bunch of ISPs. And you can't use often DHCP for this because, well, the machine in question is the DHCP server, and using it it's just too weird to do that. But so I think that actually would be really, really good, and there, and in place of your TFTP yuck, you can cross that out and put suit server.
Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, half of the list is basically what in a running implementation of pre-standard ANI we've relied on to really provide the stable connectivity use case. So I feel fairly confident about the value of this. At 50%, I'll have to rethink more on what the good ask would be. Okay, that was it.
Still you. Blimey.
Okay, so this is the still not gotten around to the bloody draft, but already trying to hire some more help to get it done. So I think we're really missing for the ANI a Yang model to really express how it's configured. And you in the first things think, hey, aren't we autonomic? No, we just have the autonomic infrastructure. And even that has a few things to configure. And even though they may be not that much, once you start getting into it, I think it's really important and good detail work to really make sure that we have a well-specified operator interface for the ANI. Next slide.
I thought we are autonomic, not for configuration.
Huh? Sorry, the microphone is strange.
Right, that's fine.
Okay, so Yang model. So in my opinion, the first priority would be to configure the ANI, right? And that starts for the ANI itself, enable and disable the ANI global per interface. And ANI to me is always you're enabling, disabling ACP and Brewski. And everything else, I think, falls into either of the Brewski, ACP, or Grasp buckets. So Brewski, of course, being the most interesting one with the biggest number of parameters that we have specified. So Brewski registrar and EST server, for the renewal, enable defined domain certificate parameters like, the domain name, or even more details when we have different address formats, selecting the address format, the CA authentication and the URL to the CA. There might also be a nice simplification of the data model, which also from an existing implementation made the deployment a lot easier, which is that basically you don't care what the bloody CA does, you just create a local CA on the JRC just for most of the lab networks and tests and everything. That simplifies it a lot, because really getting a production CA run makes the deployment of any ANI network typically a lot harder. Parameters for the master, so obviously would love to learn them from the IDEF ID part of Brewski, but if we have existing certificates that don't have that yet, then we would need to have some explicit master configuration on the JRC. And then, of course, also the aforementioned GRASP parameters for the registrar in terms of, I only want to be JRC, I'm EST, I have this priority, those things. ACP, I haven't even gotten through the whole list. I need to revisit my own draft in terms of what parameters we had. Obviously, the ones important are the ones where we need manual configuration, so the ACP connect interface to the NOC, and then explicitly configured ACP neighbors on ACP tunnels. Want to jump in directly or wait? Okay. In GRASP, I haven't gotten to it. I'm not sure if we have anything for the configuration. Next slide.
Oh, actually, I had some. It was my joke, but seriously, we are autonomic. So I would say, by default or minimal, we should have AskNest as configuration operation here. So I know in many scenarios we have to have something to be able to be able to influence, but you should at the very beginning say by default,
Oh, sure.
Those parameters has a value, so it doesn't need to be configured.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely true, right? So that's what I said. At minimum, if I, go back to my experience with existing implementation, was really just the domain name. You have default addresses, so it's only the domain name, and you say, okay, and start locally a CA. So the defaults could be very small, but let's also not forget that we would like to be able to resell the individual components like Brewski with a lot of flexible parameters into other spaces that don't have a full ANI. And of course, which raises the question then, should it be one draft? Should it be a separate Yang draft for Brewski? I think we can get to those decisions later. Okay. Next slide. If anybody wants to jump in right now, please.
Yeah, just a minor comment regarding to this slide. For GRASP, something pop up in my mind is maybe we need to configure some constant defining GRASP. For example, the default max size, which is the MTU. So if we use GRASP bug in some scenario, and it is important to figure out the proper MTU. So this may be something can address the MTU consideration for the GRASP bug, but also maybe other constant like the max hop count of the TTL hop count, such kind of things.
Yeah, and I would hope very much, chiming in with Sheng that, for a normal ANI deployment where the ACP serves GRASP, we don't really need any parameters, but given how I would also like to make GRASP something reusable, kind of the parameter model, expressing the parameter model is definitely for GRASP itself also a good thing to do. Next slide.
That's next. Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Right, so there was basically the question about the modularity, right, one or multiple. Of course, also, if we start thinking, okay, somebody just has the ACP but no Brewski, right, so are there even existing models to provision certificates through Yang? I was looking a little bit, so that's good investigation. Brewski without ACP, right, configured proxies, is that something we need? I hope, Michael would have some opinions about that, and Max. And then, we just had some discussion about GRASP without ACP. So that's basically, I think, a lot of good questions to work through. Next slide. he's going to talk when he wants to talk. So that was basically configuration. The next one is, operating, observing, so the read data, right? So first of all, obviously what we've configured, that's fine. What is additional operational data as far as state, right? So obviously in the ACP, we have the wonderful neighbor, also in the reference model, the neighbor table, right? So that's basically additional operational data we want to be able to pull. And then a little bit the question, what are the most core underlying components that we would need to make sure exist so that we really can feel safe that the troubleshooting and operational model of an ACP or ANI, even everything being autonomic, if stuff fails, do we have enough diagnostic standardized to make sure people will, get this working?
So Toros, this is what I was hoping you were going to talk about. I think I'm less interested in how do we configure with Yang an autonomic system that we shouldn't configure, and much more interested in how do we find out what it did and why, and whether it will hit another pedestrian crossing the street or not. So Yang is in the post. Tell me, I believe Yang is the our new SMI replaces SNMP. I know that we did an SNMP model in the IPsec working group back 20 years ago or something. I've never seen it used. And it might be that a bunch of these pieces actually have to go back to other working groups to do things. And we may very well be the people providing the requirements. What do we need to see? And they'll provide what's happening. And that actually may be the better model to do things. So I think I'm really enthusiastic about that.
And for outsourcing.
And it says my name, MCR renewal, maybe EST only. Oh yeah, all right.
So,
about that.
But if you like kind of operations figuring out whether it runs into something, maybe you like the next slide or not. Can we go to the next slide? So what I've seen in practical operations is that it's very hard to actually figure out problems if the only way you can figure them out is in a live case where exactly at the time when they're happening. Right. So in many cases, especially the more embedded the environment becomes, the harder it is to instrument a live environment. And then basically it only happens sometimes. So you have some guy sitting there for hours or days, seriously, trying to figure out a problem. Now, luckily, we didn't have that in the real world with ANI, but with a lot of other network problems that we have. Right. So something like a trace log model that basically, defines relevant events. For example, the individual steps of Brewski. And then if this can be done to log, for example, into local storage, you can basically take the poor devices that had the problems, look up the information later on, even if you weren't able to get all the log information live when it happened, because, you didn't have the connectivity to look at the logs, right? So that's one of these core problems. So I'll hope that the folks who know Yang better will tell us what the best ways are to express this type of functionality to really make the troubleshooting be as good as it could be. Next slide. Okay, so then the Brewski specific thing, which I think is quite important to the operations of Brewski, is really how to express the policy with pledges should be allowed into a domain. And when we started, brainstorming and architecting, this was all about whitelist or blacklist on a registrar on the JRC. And we figured that was really too limited, and you don't always want to have that type of policy locally in a network device like a JRC. So there are a lot of things now also with a bunch more parameters coming in. It's not only binary decision, but also some parameters that you return back in the certificate that might need to be more flexibly assigned on a per pledge basis. And so maybe the way to go is really define in the model for the ANI, or more specifically for the JRC, an RPC type of call from the registrar to an external server to make the decision, right? So you basically simply provide the IDEF ID, and you get in return back, binary enroll it or not, and the parameters of the certificate. And that basically, I think, gives us the smallest and most lightweight model and the most flexibility to implement the solution, keeps the JRC, I think, as simple as we can. Similarly, an RPC for the EST renewal with pretty much the same parameters. Next slide. Right, so this is basically what I was saying. Right, so then we have outside the ANI, outside what we define through the model, the kind of, policy server and the CA, so we don't need to model them, but luckily that could be somebody else's problem. Obviously, we would still love to have Yang models for those, but if we can't get them, then we at least have a nice model for the ANI.
1 minute.
Right. Yep. I think we're down on the time.
Oh.
Right. So basically, this is what I would like to see happening. So I'd really love to find more collaborators on this. And if we, have, a large enough team, we can also call a design team and try to figure out the next steps on how to go forward with this.
Okay. Yeah. So that makes us exactly on time. So yeah. Next meeting will be Montreal, Canada, July 14th to 20th. So people should take all those topics, continue discussing in the mailing list. If needed, more decision we could make in mailing list. So see you all in Montreal. Thanks. Okay. Not bad.
How do we do that?
Next time is we try to propose some your ANIMA reference model.
Mm-hmm.
We try to insert some of the trust domain concept on the top of that.
Okay.
That was a kind of trust concept